Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Foundation. Victor Romero had built his life like he built his construction empire, methodically, deliberately, and with an iron will that bent for no one. At 42, he commanded respect in Denver's development circles, not through inherited wealth or political connections, but through sheer determination and an unforgiving work ethic that had dragged him from the trailer parks of his youth to the penthouse he now called home. His wife Tessa had been the crown jewel of his achievements, or so he'd believed. They met 12 years ago when she was a struggling real estate agent, and he was just beginning to make his mark. She was beautiful in that effortless way that turned heads. Auburn hair that caught sunlight like fire, green eyes that could melt steel, and a laugh that had convinced him she was worth breaking his own rules about mixing business with pleasure. "You're too serious, Victor," she told him on their third date, her fingers tracing the scar on his knuckles, a reminder of the fights he'd won growing up poor and angry. Life's supposed to be fun. He'd married her because she represented everything his brutal childhood had lacked: warmth, beauty, and the promise of a family that wouldn't be torn apart by addiction and violence. Their daughter Emma, now 6, had seemed like proof that he'd finally built something that couldn't be destroyed. But Victor had learned early that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. His father had taught him that lesson with his fists, and the streets had reinforced it with blood and betrayal. The only reason he'd let his guard down with Tessa was that she'd seemed genuinely grateful for the life he'd given her. The house in Cherry Hills Village, the luxury cars, the country club membership that had required him to swallow his pride and pretend he belonged among people who'd inherited what he'd fought to earn. Jake Morrison had been Tessa's older brother, the golden boy who'd coasted through life on charm and his family's connections. Where Victor had clawed his way up from nothing, Jake had floated from one failed venture to another, always landing softly thanks to family money and his ability to make people like him. Victor had hired him as a favor to Tessa, giving him a position in the company's marketing department that required minimal effort and maximum visibility. The irony wasn't lost on Victor that Jake's role involved selling the dream of perfect homes to families who'd never experienced the nightmare of what happens when those dreams crumble. This particular Thursday had started like any other. Victor had been driving back from site inspection in Boulder, his mind occupied with cost overruns and permit delays, when his phone rang. Emma's voice, small and frightened, cut through his concentration like a blade. "Daddy, I need help." The words sent ice through his veins. Emma was mature for her age, had to be with Tessa's increasing tendency to treat motherhood like an inconvenient hobby, but there was something in her tone that triggered every protective instinct he'd developed. "Isn't your mother around?" he asked, already pressing harder on the accelerator. "Mom is upstairs with Uncle Jake. I'm in the basement." The phone nearly slipped from Victor's hands. Jake was supposed to be in Chicago for a trade show. He'd signed off on the travel expenses himself just 3 days ago, and Tessa had mentioned having lunch with her book club today, had even asked him to pick up Emma from school because she'd be running late. But book club met on Tuesdays. Victor's mind raced as he navigated through traffic with single-minded focus. There could be innocent explanations. Jake could have returned early. Tessa could have confused her schedule. But the careful way Emma had phrased her words, "Mom is upstairs with Uncle Jake," suggested she knew something was wrong even if she couldn't articulate what. By the time Victor pulled into his circular driveway, his hands were steady and his mind was clear. Whatever he was about to discover, he would handle it with the same calculated precision that had built his empire. He'd learned long ago that emotions were weapons that could be turned against you, but information was power that could never be taken away. The house was quiet when he entered through the front door, his footsteps muffled by the Persian rugs Tessa had insisted on despite their impracticality with a young child. He could hear faint sound from upstairs, voices, movement, something that made his jaw clench with controlled fury. He found Emma in the basement playroom, sitting on the floor with her coloring books spread around her like a defensive barrier. She looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for someone her age. Daddy, they've been making weird noises upstairs for a long time, she said quietly. And Uncle Jake's car is in the garage next to Mommy's. Victor knelt beside his daughter, studying her face for signs of trauma or confusion. What he saw instead was the sharp intelligence he'd hoped she'd inherited from him, combined with an intuitive understanding that her world was about to change. How long have they been upstairs, sweetheart? Since before lunch. Uncle Jake came over and said he had a surprise for Mommy. They went upstairs and told me to play down here and not bother them. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Jake's car hidden in the garage. The careful instruction to keep Emma away. The timing that coincided with Victor's scheduled absence. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a recent development. This was planned, deliberate, and had probably been going on for months. Victor felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. The same ruthless calm that had carried him through the worst moments of his life. He'd been betrayed before, by his father, by business partners, by friends who'd smiled to his face while plotting behind his back. But this was different. This wasn't just about money or pride. This was about the family he'd built, the trust he'd given, and the future he'd planned. And Victor Romero had never forgiven a betrayal in his life. Chapter 2. Gathering Storms. The next 3 weeks passed in a carefully orchestrated performance of normalcy. Victor continued his daily routines with mechanical precision while conducting the most important investigation of his life. He'd learned patience in the Army, before construction, during the years when one wrong move could mean the difference between survival and destruction. Now that patience served him as he documented every detail of his wife's affair. He hired a private investigator named Carl Hoffman, a former police detective who specialized in domestic cases. Victor chose him not for his discretion, though that was important, but for his reputation as someone who found evidence that would hold up in court. Victor had no intention of being blindsided by legal technicalities when the time came to act. "You want the full package?" Hoffman had asked during their first meeting in a downtown coffee shop. "Photos, timeline, financial records, communication logs?" "Everything," Victor had replied. "I want to know how long this has been going on, where they meet, who else knows about it, and what they've been saying about me behind my back." The investigation revealed a betrayal more comprehensive than Victor had imagined. Phone records showed daily calls between Tessa and Jake dating back 8 months. Credit card statements revealed hotel charges, restaurant visits, and shopping trips that coincided with Victor's business travel. Most damning of all were the text messages Hoffman recovered, filled with intimate details and cruel jokes about Victor's intensity and his trailer park paranoia. But it was the financial records that truly ignited Victor's fury. Tessa had been systematically moving money from their joint accounts into a personal savings account she'd opened without his knowledge. Not enough to trigger his attention individually, but over 8 months it totaled nearly $400,000. She was planning her exit strategy, and she was using his money to fund it. Jake, meanwhile, had been charging personal expenses to the company credit card and billing private clients through Victor's firm for work that had nothing to do with their projects. He'd stolen approximately $150,000 in combined theft and billing fraud, all while playing the role of grateful brother-in-law at family dinners. They're planning to leave together, Hoffman reported during their final meeting. "Jake's been looking at properties in Austin, and your wife's been researching custody laws. They think they're being careful, but they're amateurs at this game." Victor studied the photographs spread across the table. Images of his wife and brother-in-law in intimate embraces, entering hotels, laughing together in restaurants he'd never been invited to join. In every photo, they looked happy in a way that made his chest tighten with something deeper than anger. "There's one more thing," Hoffman said, his expression carefully neutral. "Your daughter. They've been discussing what to do about her. From what I could piece together, Jake isn't interested in being a stepfather, and your wife seems willing to negotiate on custody if it means starting fresh." That was the moment Victor's last trace of humanity died. He'd been prepared for the affair, had even begun to accept the financial theft as the cost of learning what kind of person he'd married. But the idea that they were planning to abandon Emma, or worse, use her as a bargaining chip in their escape plan, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. At home, Victor maintained his facade while watching Tessa with new eyes. She moved through their house like an actress playing a role, going through the motions of being a wife and mother while clearly planning her exit. She was better at deception than he'd given her credit for, but now that he knew what to look for, he could see the tells. The way she checked her phone constantly, the excuse-making for simple errands, the gradual emotional withdrawal that she disguised as stress from Emma's school activities. Jake continued showing up for family dinners and company meetings, playing the part of loyal brother-in-law and grateful employee. He'd even had the audacity to suggest Victor take a vacation, claiming he looked stressed and needed time away from work. "You should surprise Tessa with a weekend getaway," Jake had suggested over dinner. "I could watch Emma. Give you two some time to reconnect." Victor had smiled and thanked him for the suggestion, all while imagining how satisfying it would be to watch Jake's world collapse around him. The planning began in earnest once Victor had all the facts. He'd built his business by thinking several moves ahead of his competitors, by anticipating problems before they materialized and having solutions ready. Now he applied that same strategic thinking to the destruction of two people who had betrayed him at the deepest level. The key was patience and misdirection. If Victor moved too quickly or obviously, they might escape with minimal consequences. But if he was smart about it, if he played his cards carefully, he could ensure that they lost everything: their relationship, their freedom, their future, and any chance of finding happiness elsewhere. Victor's first move was to document everything legally. He met with his attorney, Elizabeth Valdez, a razor-sharp divorce lawyer who specialized in high-asset cases involving infidelity. She reviewed Hoffman's evidence with professional approval. "This is exceptionally solid," she said. "Colorado is a no-fault state, but adultery can still impact property division and custody arrangements, especially when there's evidence of financial misconduct. With this level of documentation, we can pursue full custody and minimal alimony." "That's just the beginning," Victor replied. "I want them to face criminal charges for the theft. I want Jake blacklisted from the industry. And I want Tessa to understand exactly what it means to cross someone like me." Elizabeth studied him carefully. "Victor, I understand you're angry, but we need to be smart about this. Don't do anything that could compromise the legal case or put you at risk." Victor nodded, but privately he was thinking far beyond legal consequences. Courts could award him custody and financial damages, but they couldn't restore the years of his life he'd wasted on two people who'd been planning to destroy him from the inside. For that kind of betrayal, the punishment needed to be more personal. The second phase of his plan involved financial preparation. Victor began moving assets into accounts and investments that Tessa couldn't access or claim. He restructured his business holdings, created trusts for Emma's future, and quietly liquidated joint assets that could be disputed in divorce proceedings. Every move was legal, carefully documented, and designed to ensure that when the time came, Tessa would walk away with as little as possible. But the third phase, the part that would satisfy the cold fury burning in his chest, required more creativity. Victor had always believed that the best revenge was living well, but sometimes living well meant ensuring that your enemies couldn't live well at all. Chapter 3. The Unforeseen Scene. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after Victor had begun documenting his wife's betrayal. He'd planned it that way, of course. Thursdays were when he typically conducted site visits, and Tessa had grown comfortable with the pattern. What she didn't know was that Victor had started returning home randomly, testing whether she'd maintain her schedule of afternoon rendezvous with his brother-in-law. "Daddy, I need help." Emma's voice carried that same frightened tone that had alerted him to the situation weeks earlier. "Isn't your mother around?" Victor asked, following the script they'd unconsciously established. "Mom is upstairs with Uncle Jake. I'm in the basement." This time, Victor was prepared. Hidden cameras had been recording the house for the past week. Motion sensors tracked movement throughout the building, and audio equipment captured conversations in every room except Emma's bedroom and playroom, spaces Victor considered sacred and off-limits to his surveillance. He'd known they were upstairs together. He'd watched them arrive separately through his phone app, had seen Jake sneak through the back entrance while Tessa dismissed Emma to the basement. What Victor hadn't expected was the tsunami of rage that hit him as he drove home. Knowing this time, he wouldn't be walking into a surprise. He'd be walking into a carefully orchestrated confrontation. The house felt different when he entered through the front door. The air seemed charged with tension, and the sounds from upstairs were unmistakably intimate. Victor moved through his home like a predator, every sense heightened, every muscle coiled for action. He found Emma exactly where he'd expected, surrounded by her coloring books and looking up at him with eyes that held far too much wisdom for a 6-year-old. "Daddy, they've been making weird noises upstairs for a long time," she said, repeating her lines from 3 weeks ago with heartbreaking consistency. "And Uncle Jake's car is in the garage next to Mommy's." Victor knelt beside his daughter, fighting to keep his voice gentle despite the storm raging inside him. "Emma, I need you to do something for me. Go pack a bag with your favorite clothes and toys. We're going to have a sleepover at Grandpa Martinez's house tonight." Emma's face lit up with genuine excitement. Victor's father-in-law was the only member of Tessa's family he'd ever respected. A retired Marine who'd built a successful plumbing business and raised his children with discipline and values. More importantly, he was someone who would understand what Victor was about to do and why it was necessary. "Should I tell Mommy we're leaving?" Emma asked, already gathering her coloring supplies. "Let's surprise her," Victor said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Go pack quickly, sweetheart. We'll leave in 10 minutes. While Emma prepared for her unexpected adventure, Victor made his way upstairs with the silent precision he'd learned during his Army service. The sounds grew louder as he approached the master bedroom. Sounds that would have destroyed a weaker man, but only strengthened Victor's resolve. He paused outside the door, listening to their conversation between moments of passion. "Can't keep doing this much longer," Jake was saying, slightly out of breath. "He's been asking more questions about my travel schedule." "You worry too much," Tessa replied, her voice carrying a breathless laugh. Victor only sees what he wants to see. He's so focused on his precious construction projects that he couldn't spot an affair if we did it on his desk. "Still, maybe we should accelerate our timeline. The money you've saved up, plus what I've managed to skim from his accounts." "Another month," Tessa interrupted. "I want to make sure we have enough for Emma's custody battle. My lawyer says we'll need at least $100,000 for legal fees if Victor decides to fight us." "And if he doesn't want custody?" "If he's too proud to chase after a wife who doesn't want him anymore. Then we get lucky and Emma becomes his problem to solve. Either way, we win." Victor's hand clenched around his phone, which was recording every word. In that moment, listening to them discuss Emma like she was an inconvenient obstacle rather than a human being, he felt something fundamental shift inside him. The last traces of mercy, the final threads of the man who'd once believed in forgiveness and second chances, snapped like overstressed cables. He took one photograph through the cracked door, not for legal evidence, since he already had plenty, but because he wanted them to know he'd seen them at their most vulnerable moment. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. Emma was waiting by the front door with a small suitcase, her face glowing with excitement about the unexpected adventure. Victor swept her into his arms, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and letting her presence calm the nuclear fury burning in his chest. "Ready for our sleepover?" he asked. "Ready. Will you tell me a story about when you were little?" "I'll tell you whatever you want to hear, baby girl." As they drove away from the house, Victor glanced in his rearview mirror and felt a strange sense of finality. He was leaving behind more than just a building. He was leaving behind the man he'd been for the past 12 years. The man who believed in trust and forgiveness, who'd thought love could conquer the brutal lessons of his childhood. That man was dead. What remained was the person Victor had been before Tessa softened him. Someone who understood that the world was divided into predators and prey, and the only way to survive was to ensure you were never again caught in a position of weakness. His phone buzzed with a text message from Tessa, "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." Victor smiled for the first time in weeks and typed back, "No problem. Sleep well." By the time Tessa realized he'd been in the house, by the time she and Jake understood that their careful charade had been exposed, Victor would be ready to show them exactly what happened to people who mistook his love for weakness. The war had begun, and Victor Romero had never lost a war in his life. Chapter 4. The Calm Before Destruction. The next morning brought a carefully choreographed performance of innocence. Tessa called Victor's phone 3 times before he answered, her voice carrying perfectly calibrated concern about Emma's whereabouts. "Victor, where are you? Emma's not in her room, and your car was gone when I woke up." "We had an impromptu father-daughter adventure," Victor replied, watching Emma feed ducks at the park near her grandfather's house. "You looked so peaceful sleeping. I didn't want to disturb you. You should have told me. I was worried sick." The lie came so easily that Victor almost admired her skill. According to his surveillance footage, Tessa hadn't checked Emma's room until nearly noon, and her first call had been to Jake, not to her supposedly missing daughter. "Sorry, sweetheart. We'll be home this afternoon." When they returned to the house, Victor observed his wife with the detached fascination of a scientist studying a particularly interesting specimen. She moved through the motions of concerned motherhood, hugging Emma, asking about their adventure, expressing relief that everyone was safe. But her body language betrayed her distraction. She kept checking her phone, glancing toward the stairs, touching surfaces that might have revealed evidence of Victor's presence. Jake arrived for their scheduled family dinner an hour late, claiming traffic delays that Victor knew were actually time spent coaching Tessa on how to handle any potential suspicions. He played his role perfectly: concerned uncle, grateful employee, devoted brother-in-law who'd rushed over the moment he heard about Emma's disappearance. "You can't just take off like that without telling anyone," Jake said, his tone carefully balanced between authority and affection. "What if there had been an emergency?" Victor nodded thoughtfully, as if accepting the wisdom of Jake's concern. "You're absolutely right. Family should always know where family is." The emphasis on the final sentence was subtle enough that Tessa missed it entirely, but Jake's eyes flickered with momentary uncertainty. He was smarter than Tessa, more intuitive about potential threats, but he was also arrogant enough to believe he could outmaneuver someone he'd always considered a blue-collar upstart. Over dinner, Victor played his part flawlessly while internally cataloging every detail that confirmed his surveillance evidence. The way Tessa and Jake avoided eye contact, except for brief, heated glances when they thought he wasn't looking. The synchronized checking of phones. The subtle body language that spoke of intimate familiarity disguised as casual family interaction. "I've been thinking about taking that vacation you suggested," Victor told Jake as they cleared the dinner dishes. "Maybe next weekend. Somewhere isolated, where we can really disconnect from everything." "That's a great idea," Jake replied, too quickly. "Very important to recharge. Would you mind watching Emma again? I know it's a lot to ask, but Tessa and I could really use some time alone together." Victor saw the quick exchange of glances between his wife and brother-in-law, the silent communication of conspirators who thought they'd been handed an unexpected gift. "Of course," Jake said. "Emma and I always have fun together. And maybe you could stay over," Tessa added, her voice carefully casual, "in case she needs anything during the night." "Perfect," Victor agreed. "I'll make reservations tomorrow." That night, as Tessa lay beside him pretending to sleep, Victor stared at the ceiling and finalized his plans. The vacation would indeed happen, but not in the way his wife and brother-in-law expected. Instead of providing them with an opportunity for an extended rendezvous, it would serve as the trigger for the systematic destruction of their lives. Phase 1 involved the business. Victor spent the next day meticulously documenting Jake's financial theft with his forensic accountant, creating an airtight case for criminal prosecution. He also prepared termination papers that would immediately revoke Jake's access to company accounts, facilities, and clients. But the termination would wait until after the vacation, when Jake would be too distracted by other catastrophes to mount any kind of defense. Phase 2 targeted Tessa's support network. Victor had always maintained cordial relationships with her friends and family, understanding that social connections were crucial to his wife's self-image. Now he would use those relationships to ensure that when the truth came out, Tessa would find herself completely isolated. He started with Tessa's sister, Monica, a divorced mother of two who'd always resented what she saw as Tessa's easy life. Victor called her under the pretense of planning a surprise party for Tessa's upcoming birthday. "I want to include all her closest friends," he explained. "Maybe you could help me understand who she's been spending time with lately? I've been so busy with work that I feel out of touch with her social circle." Monica was eager to help, and even more eager to share gossip about her sister's recent behavior. "Honestly, Victor, I've been worried about her," Monica confided. "She's been so secretive lately, always making excuses for why she can't do family things. And she's been spending a lot of money on clothes and trips that she says are for self-care, but it seems excessive. Has she mentioned any new friends? Anyone she might be confiding in?" "Not really. Although," Monica hesitated, "I probably shouldn't say this, but Jake's been around a lot more than usual. Like a lot more. They claim it's business stuff, helping with your company, but it just seems weird how much time they spend together." Victor let the silence stretch, allowing Monica's natural suspicion to build momentum. "I'm probably overthinking it," she added quickly. "I mean, Jake's family, but something just feels off, you know?" "I appreciate you looking out for her," Victor said. "Family should always protect family." By the end of the conversation, Victor had planted seeds of suspicion that would blossom into social destruction when the truth was revealed. Monica would remember this conversation, would realize she'd been used as an unwitting spy, and would ensure that everyone in Tessa's social circle knew exactly what kind of person they'd been defending. Phase 3 was the most delicate, preparing Emma for the changes ahead without traumatizing her or turning her against her mother. Victor had consulted with a child psychologist, Dr. Sarah Chun, under the guise of wanting to help Emma adjust to his demanding work schedule. "Children are remarkably resilient," Dr. Chun had assured him, "but they need stability and honesty appropriate to their developmental level. If major changes are coming to your family structure, the most important thing is ensuring Emma feels secure and loved." Victor arranged for Emma to spend more time with her grandfather Martinez, a man who understood the value of discipline and loyalty. He also enrolled her in martial arts classes, partly for self-defense, but mostly to instill the kind of mental toughness she'd need to navigate the world as his daughter. "Daddy, why are you teaching me so many new things?" Emma asked as they drove home from her first karate lesson. "Because the world can be a dangerous place, sweetheart. People sometimes pretend to be something they're not, and they might try to hurt the people we love. I want you to be strong enough to protect yourself and smart enough to see through their lies." Emma absorbed this information with the seriousness she applied to all of Victor's lessons. She was already beginning to understand that her father was different from other parents, harder, more demanding, but also more reliable than anyone else in her life. "Even Mommy?" she asked quietly. Victor glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror, seeing in her eyes the same intuitive understanding that had allowed her to recognize something was wrong that first day. "Especially people who are supposed to love us," he said. "Those are the ones who can hurt us the most." As the week progressed, Victor fine-tuned every aspect of his revenge plan. He studied his enemies with the patience of a chess master, understanding their weaknesses, their fears, their dependencies. Tessa needed social approval and financial security. Jake craved respect and admiration he'd never earned. Both of them had built their self-worth on foundations that Victor could systematically destroy. By Friday evening, as he confirmed their weekend reservations at a remote cabin in the mountains, Victor felt the familiar calm that preceded decisive action. Tomorrow, Tessa and Jake would believe they were finally free to pursue their relationship openly, thinking Victor would be safely out of the way for an entire weekend. Instead, they would discover that Victor Romero had spent weeks studying them, understanding them, and preparing their complete destruction. The war wasn't coming. It was already here. Victor had simply been allowing his enemies to position themselves for total defeat. Chapter 5. The Setup. Saturday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn in the Rockies. Victor loaded his truck with enough gear to suggest a serious camping trip. Tent, sleeping bags, fishing equipment, and enough food for a long weekend in the wilderness. Tessa watched from the kitchen window, her expression carefully neutral, but unable to hide the anticipation in her posture. "You sure you'll be okay without us?" Victor asked, wrapping his arms around his wife from behind in a gesture that had once been genuine affection, but now served as psychological warfare. "I'll miss you terribly," Tessa replied, her voice carrying the exact tone of forced regret she'd probably practiced in the mirror. "But sometimes a girl needs time to herself, you know?" "I know exactly what you mean," Victor said, allowing his lips to brush against her ear in a way that made her shiver. Though whether from guilt or arousal, he neither knew nor cared. Emma hugged her father goodbye with the fierce intensity of a child who sensed changes she couldn't articulate. Victor had spent the previous evening preparing her for what was coming, though not in ways she could understand at the time. "Remember what we talked about?" he whispered into her hair. "Be strong, be smart, and know that Daddy loves you more than anything in the world." "I love you too, Daddy. Catch lots of fish." "I'll catch everything I need to catch, baby girl." Victor drove exactly far enough to establish his alibi, a gas station receipt from a town 2 hours away, a conversation with a park ranger who would remember the serious man asking about isolated camping spots, a fishing license purchased with his credit card. Then he doubled back using secondary roads, arriving at a motel 15 miles from his house where he'd rented a room under a false name 2 weeks earlier. The surveillance equipment in his house transmitted to his laptop with crystal clarity. He watched Jake arrive at 11:30 a.m., using his key to enter through the front door with the confidence of someone who believed himself welcome. Tessa met him with an embrace that confirmed everything Victor needed to know about their relationship. "He's really gone?" Jake asked, his voice carrying clearly through the audio system. "Just drove off with enough gear for a week," Tessa replied. "We have a whole weekend." "And Emma?" "Swimming lessons at the club until 4, then dinner and a sleepover at Monica's. We're completely alone until tomorrow night." Victor watched them move through his house like they owned it, saw Jake examine his liquor cabinet and help himself to the 50-year-old scotch Victor had been saving for a special occasion. The irony wasn't lost on him that Jake had chosen correctly. This was indeed a special occasion, just not the kind he was anticipating. They settled into the living room, and Victor listened to them discuss their plans with the casual cruelty of people who believe themselves immune to consequences. "The Austin house will be perfect," Jake said, scrolling through property listings on his tablet. "Far enough from Denver that we won't have to deal with his attempts to stay involved with Emma." "About Emma," Tessa said, her tone shifting to something more calculating. "My lawyer thinks we might be able to negotiate sole custody if we can prove Victor's work schedule makes him an unsuitable parent. And if he fights it, then we let him have her. Honestly, Jake, I love Emma, but I'm tired of being a mother. I want to be someone's girlfriend again, someone's lover, not just a housewife and chauffeur." Victor's finger hovered over the keyboard, resisting the urge to trigger the surprise he'd prepared for later. The conversation was providing evidence that would be invaluable in custody proceedings, but more importantly, it was confirming that his decision to destroy them was not just justified, but morally necessary. "What about money?" Jay continued. "Even with what we've saved and skimmed, starting over won't be cheap." "I've been thinking about that," Tessa said, moving closer to Jake on the couch. "Victor's business is worth millions, but most of his assets are tied up in investments and property. However, there's the life insurance policy." Victor's blood turned to ice as he listened to his wife detail his life insurance. Policies worth $3.2 million that would make Tessa wealthy beyond her wildest dreams if something happened to him. "You're not seriously suggesting?" Jake started. "I'm not suggesting anything," Tessa replied quickly. "I'm just saying that sometimes life provides opportunities, and smart people recognize them when they appear." "Jesus, Tessa, that's dark even for you." Victor's job is dangerous. Construction sites, heavy equipment, long drives through mountain roads. Accidents happen all the time. The casual way she discussed his death, not with the heat of passion or anger, but with the cold calculation of someone planning a business transaction, crystallized Victor's resolve. He'd been prepared to destroy their relationship and their finances. Now he understood he needed to destroy their freedom as well. He made 2 phone calls. The first was to Carl Hoffman, his private investigator. I need you to document everything happening at my house right now, Victor said. Video, audio, photographs. And I need you to research any connections between my wife and people who might be willing to arrange accidents. Victor, that sounds like you think. I think my wife and brother-in-law are discussing the best way to murder me for insurance money. I need evidence that will convince police they're serious about it. The second call was to Elizabeth Valdez, his attorney. Elizabeth, I need you to draft emergency custody papers immediately. Full custody, based on evidence of adultery, financial theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. Murder? Victor, what exactly is happening? I'm watching my wife plan my death while her lover drinks my scotch. I need those papers ready to file first thing Monday morning, and I need you to contact the police about the conspiracy charges. Are you safe? Do you need to call 911? I'm safe, and I have everything under control. But Elizabeth, this ends Monday. I want them both in handcuffs before noon. Victor spent the rest of the afternoon documenting every detail of their weekend together. He watched them make love in his bed, eat dinner at his table, and plan his death with the casual efficiency of people discussing vacation itineraries. By evening, he had enough evidence to ensure they would never see freedom again. But mere imprisonment wasn't enough. These people had betrayed his trust, stolen his money, discussed murdering him, and planned to abandon his daughter. They deserved something more personal than prison. They deserved to understand exactly what it felt like to have their world systematically destroyed by someone they'd underestimated. At 11 p.m., Victor initiated the first phase of their destruction. Using his phone, he triggered the smart home security system he had installed the previous week, a system Jake and Tessa didn't know existed. Every door and window in the house locked automatically. The temperature dropped to 50 degrees. And the sound system began playing a recording he'd prepared specifically for this moment. Hello, Tessa. Hello, Jake. Victor's voice echoed through every room in the house, calm and controlled. I hope you've enjoyed your weekend in my home, drinking my scotch and planning my murder. Now it's time for us to have a conversation about consequences. Through his surveillance cameras, Victor watched them leap apart on the couch, their faces pale with terror as they realized their weekend getaway had become a prison. The doors are locked, the windows are sealed, and the phone lines have been cut. You're going to sit there and listen while I explain exactly what's going to happen to your lives. And then you're going to understand why crossing Victor Romero was the biggest mistake you ever made. The hunt had begun, and Victor had never felt more alive. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs. The panic in their eyes was everything Victor had hoped for. Through the surveillance feed, he watched Tessa and Jake stumble through his house like trapped animals, testing doors that wouldn't open, windows that wouldn't budge, phones that produced no dial tone. The smart home system he'd installed was military-grade, designed for maximum security estates, and it responded only to his biometric authorization or his master phone. This is insane, Jake shouted at the ceiling, apparently hoping Victor could hear him. You can't just lock us in here. Actually, I can, Victor's voice replied through the sound system, his tone conversational. It's my house, after all. You're just guests who've overstayed their welcome. Victor had positioned himself in a rental car across the street, close enough to watch the house, while maintaining plausible deniability about his location. The surveillance equipment was broadcasting to multiple devices, ensuring he captured every moment of their breakdown from different angles. Here's what's going to happen, Victor continued, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned in the army. First, you're going to tell me exactly how long you've been planning my murder. Second, you're going to explain how you intended to make it look like an accident. And third, you're going to transfer every stolen dollar back to my accounts while I watch. We weren't, Tessa started. Don't. Victor's voice cut through a protest like a blade. I've been listening to you for hours. I know about the insurance money, the Austin house, your plans to abandon Emma. I know about the money you've stolen, the lies you've told, and the murder you've been discussing. So don't insult my intelligence with denials. Through the cameras, Victor watched his wife collapse onto the couch, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. Jake, meanwhile, was examining the windows with the desperate intensity of someone beginning to understand he was trapped with a predator. You want to know the really interesting thing? Victor continued. I've been documenting your affair for weeks. I have photographs, video recordings, financial records, and now audio of you discussing my murder. My attorney has copies of everything, with instructions to release them to police if anything happens to me. Victor, please. Tessa's voice was barely a whisper. Let's explain. Oh, you'll explain everything. But first, I want you to understand what you've lost. Victor triggered the next phase of his revelation. The television screens throughout the house came alive with a slideshow he'd prepared. Bank statements showing their theft, photographs of their hotel meetings, transcripts of their text messages, and finally, the property listings for the Austin house they planned to share. Jake, Victor said, his voice hardening. In approximately 6 hours, you'll be terminated from my company and arrested for embezzlement. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and my attorney assures me you'll serve 5 to 7 years minimum. Jake's face had gone white as bone. He understood the implications better than Tessa, understood that a theft conviction would destroy any chance he had of working in construction again, would make him unemployable in any industry that required bonding or financial trust. But that's just the beginning, Victor continued. See, I've also been examining your other business dealings. The side contracts you've been running through my company's name. The permits you've been expediting with bribes. The safety violations you've been covering up. When the authorities start investigating you, they're going to find a lot more than simple embezzlement. This was a bluff, but a calculated one. Victor knew Jake's character well enough to understand he'd been cutting corners and bending rules for years. The fear in Jake's eyes confirmed that the bluff had hit home. Tessa, Victor said, turning his attention to his wife. Your situation is more complicated. See, Colorado is a no-fault divorce state, but it's not a no-consequences state. When we divorce, and we will divorce, you'll be entitled to exactly nothing. The prenup you signed covers adultery, quite specifically. What prenup? Tessa's voice was barely audible. The one your lawyer told you to read carefully before signing. The one you initialed on every page while distracted by wedding planning. You do remember your lawyer, don't you? My old army buddy who owed me a favor. The color drained from Tessa's face as she realized she'd been outmaneuvered from the very beginning. The prenup she'd barely glanced at, trusting that love would conquer all legal complications, had been written by Victor's friend specifically to protect him in case of infidelity. And then there's Emma, Victor said, his voice turning deadly soft. My daughter, who you've been planning to abandon or use as a bargaining chip. The custody evaluation will be very interested in your statements about being tired of motherhood. We never said, Jake started. I want to be someone's girlfriend again, someone's lover, not just a housewife and chauffeur. Those were your exact words, Tessa. All recorded, all time-stamped, all admissible in family court. Victor paused, letting the weight of their situation settle over them like a burial shroud. But here's the thing that really amazes me, he continued. After everything you've stolen, everything you've planned, you're still thinking like amateurs. You thought you could outmaneuver someone who built an empire from nothing? You thought I'd achieved everything I have by being trusting and forgiving. Through the surveillance cameras, Victor watched them begin to truly understand the scope of their miscalculation. They'd mistaken his love for weakness, his trust for stupidity, his happiness for complacency. So here's what's going to happen next, Victor said. You're going to transfer every stolen dollar back to my accounts. You're going to write detailed confessions about your theft, your affair, and your murder conspiracy. And you're going to do it all while my cameras record everything for posterity. And if we refuse, Jake asked, his voice cracking, then you stay locked in that house until you change your minds. The refrigerator is full, the water works, and I can keep you there for weeks if necessary. The only question is whether you want to cooperate now or after you've gotten hungry enough to see reason. Victor had no intention of actually keeping them in prison for weeks. That would cross lines that even his fury wouldn't allow him to breach. But they didn't know that, and their panic was serving his purposes perfectly. You're insane, Tessa whispered. No, Victor replied, his voice carrying the cold certainty that had carried him through every battle of his life. I'm thorough, and I'm someone who never, ever forgives a betrayal. He gave them 30 minutes to discuss their options while he prepared the final phase of their destruction. By Monday morning, Jake would be in police custody and Tessa would be facing divorce papers that would leave her with nothing but her shame. But first, he wanted them to experience the same helplessness and terror they'd planned to inflict on him. After all, Victor Romero had never been interested in mercy for his enemies. Chapter 7. The Reckoning begins. By dawn, Victor's captives had broken completely. Through the surveillance feeds, he'd watched them cycle through rage, bargaining, and finally desperate acceptance as they realized the futility of their situation. Jake had spent hours examining every possible escape route, while Tessa had retreated into a catatonic state, staring at the financial documents Victor had forced them to review. The confessions had been extracted shortly before sunrise, both of them speaking into the cameras with the hollow voices of defeated prisoners. Jake admitted to stealing $187,000 through various schemes, more than Victor had originally calculated. Tessa confessed to moving $463,000 into hidden accounts and detailed their timeline for murdering Victor, making it look like a construction accident. "We never would have actually done it," she whispered to the camera, tears streaming down her face. "It was just fantasy, just stupid talk. Fantasy." Victor's voice cut through the sound system like a whip. "You researched my insurance policies. You discussed timing. You planned how to spend the money. That's not fantasy, Tessa. That's premeditation." At 7 a.m., Victor finally released the locks and allowed them to leave. He watched from his rental car as they stumbled out of the house like survivors of a natural disaster, their clothes wrinkled, their faces pale with exhaustion and terror. Jake's hands were shaking so badly he could barely start his car. They drove away in opposite directions, Tessa to her sister's house, Jake to his apartment, neither of them understanding that their public humiliation had only just begun. Victor returned home and took a long shower, washing away the satisfaction and fury of a night's work. When Emma returned from her sleepover at noon, she found her father making pancakes in a kitchen that showed no signs of the previous night's psychological warfare. "Did you catch lots of fish, Daddy?" she asked, climbing onto his lap while he fed her breakfast. "I caught everything I went looking for, sweetheart." Emma studied his face with the intensity she'd inherited from him. "You look different. Happier." "Sometimes hunting is good for the soul," Victor replied, not entirely sure she'd understand, but knowing she'd file the comment away for future consideration. Monday morning brought the systematic destruction Victor had spent weeks orchestrating. At 8 a.m., Jake arrived at the office to find his key card deactivated and security guards waiting to escort him from the building. Victor met them in the lobby, his expression professionally neutral as he handed Jake a folder containing termination papers, criminal charges, and a bill for restitution. "You have 48 hours to return all company property and arrange payment of the money you've stolen," Victor said. "After that, the authorities take over." Jake's attempt to maintain dignity crumbled as the security guards flanked him. "Victor, we can work this out. We're family." "No," Victor replied, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Family doesn't steal from family. Family doesn't betray family. And family sure as hell doesn't plan to murder family for insurance money." The criminal charges were filed by noon, with Victor providing boxes of evidence to a detective who seemed impressed by the thoroughness of the case. "I've never seen documentation this complete," Detective Riley commented. "Most domestic cases are he said, she said. This is like watching a confession recorded in real time." "I believe in being thorough," Victor replied. The divorce papers were served to Tessa at 2 p.m., delivered by a process server who found her hiding at her sister's house. Monica called Victor within an hour, her voice shrill with rage and confusion. "What the hell is going on, Victor?" "Tessa is hysterical, claiming you held them prisoner and forced confessions out of them." "Did she mention the part where she and Jake were planning to murder me for the insurance money?" Victor asked calmly. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "That's impossible," Monica finally whispered. "I have recordings, Monica. Hours of them. Your sister and your brother discussing the best way to make my death look accidental so they could collect $3.2 million and moved to Austin together. Oh God. Oh my God. Read the divorce papers when she shows them to you. Listen to the recordings when the police play them during Jake's trial. Then ask yourself how well you really knew your siblings. By evening, Victor's phone was buzzing with calls from Tessa's friends and family members, all demanding explanations for what seemed like insanely vindictive behavior toward two people they considered victims of Victor's controlling personality. One by one, Victor provided them with evidence, financial records, surveillance footage, audio recordings that painted a picture of systematic betrayal and premeditated murder. The transformation was remarkable. Within hours, Tessa went from being seen as the victim of a controlling husband to being recognized as a would-be murderer who'd been planning to abandon her daughter. Jake's reputation in Denver's construction community was destroyed by noon Tuesday when Victor circulated the evidence to every major contractor in the city. But the most satisfying moment came Wednesday afternoon when Victor received a call from Detective Riley. "Mr. Romero, we've arrested Jake Morrison on charges of embezzlement, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud. Based on the evidence you provided, the district attorney is confident of conviction on all counts." "What about my wife?" "The conspiracy charges are more complicated because most of the planning was verbal, but we're building a case. Her confession to moving money and planning her death gives us a good foundation. And custody of my daughter? Given the evidence of planned abandonment and the criminal charges, I don't think there will be much dispute about that." That evening, Victor sat on his back deck watching Emma play in the yard while he reviewed the financial damage assessment his forensic accountant had provided. Between the recovered stolen money, the insurance money that would never be paid, and the assets Tessa would forfeit in the divorce, he was actually in a stronger financial position than before the betrayal. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that Jake and Tessa were beginning to understand the full scope of their miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with a successful businessman who'd gotten soft in middle age. Instead, they declared war on someone who'd learned survival from the streets, strategy from the army, and ruthlessness from building an empire with his bare hands. "Daddy." Emma appeared beside his chair, her small hand resting on his arm. "Are you and Mommy getting divorced?" Victor had been dreading this conversation, but Emma's direct approach made it easier somehow. "Yes, sweetheart. Mommy made some very bad choices, and she can't live with us anymore. Because she was with Uncle Jake when she shouldn't have been." The perceptiveness of the question caught Victor off guard. "How did you know that?" "I'm not stupid, Daddy. I saw them together lots of times when you weren't home. They told me not to tell you because it was a surprise they were planning." Victor felt a new wave of fury at the realization that they'd been using his daughter to cover their affair, manipulating her natural desire to please adults into complicity with their betrayal. "You're never going to see Uncle Jake again," Victor said. "And you might not see Mommy very much either." "Good," Emma replied with startling firmness. "Uncle Jake was mean when you weren't around, and Mommy was always on her phone or telling me to go play somewhere else. Are you okay with it just being us?" Emma climbed into his lap and nestled against his chest. "We're stronger together, Daddy, just like you taught me." As the sun set over the mountains, Victor held his daughter and felt a sense of completion he hadn't experienced since discovering the betrayal. He protected what mattered, destroyed what threatened him, and ensured that justice was served with the kind of precision that courts and laws couldn't provide. Jake and Tessa had made the fatal error of mistaking his love for weakness and his trust for stupidity. Now they were learning that Victor Romero had never forgiven a betrayal in his life, and he wasn't about to start with the people who'd betrayed him most deeply. The war was nearly over, and victory had never tasted sweeter. Chapter 8. Consequences Unfold. 3 months later, Victor sat in the gallery of Denver District Court watching Jake Morrison receive his sentence. 7 years in state prison for embezzlement, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud. The man who'd once sat at Victor's dinner table, who'd shaken his hand and called him family, now stood in orange jumpsuit shackles, his face gaunt from stress and his eyes holding the hollow look of someone who'd finally understood the true cost of his betrayal. The prosecution had been devastating in its thoroughness. Every piece of evidence Victor had provided was admissible, every recording crystal clear, every financial document ironclad. Jake's defense attorney, a public defender overwhelmed by the case, had attempted to argue that the conspiracy to commit murder was merely fantasy, desperate talk between lovers who never intended to act. District Attorney Patricia Valdez, no relation to Victor's divorce lawyer, had destroyed that argument with clinical precision. Fantasy doesn't involve researching insurance policies, she told the jury. Fantasy doesn't include detailed discussions of timing and method. Fantasy doesn't involve moving money in preparation for a new life funded by the victim's death. This was premeditation, planning, and conspiracy, nothing more and nothing less. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. In the months since his arrest, Jake's life had collapsed in ways that went far beyond the legal consequences. His construction license was revoked, his professional reputation destroyed, and his assets seized to pay restitution. The woman he'd been willing to murder had abandoned him the moment his usefulness ended, refusing to visit him in jail or even accept his phone calls. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Patricia Chin said as she pronounced sentence, "you violated every trust placed in you as an employee, as a family member, and as a member of society. Your actions represent a level of betrayal that strikes at the foundation of human relationships." Victor felt no satisfaction in watching a broken man receive his punishment. The satisfaction had come months earlier, when justice was certain rather than hopeful. This was simply the conclusion of a process that had been inevitable from the moment Jake had decided to betray the man who'd given him everything. Tessa's legal situation was more complex, but no less devastating. The divorce had been finalized 6 weeks after the initial filing, with Victor receiving full custody of Emma, complete control of all marital assets, and a restraining order that prohibited Tessa from coming within 500 feet of their daughter. The criminal charges against Tessa were harder to prosecute than those against Jake, since much of her involvement had been verbal rather than documented. But the conspiracy charges were solid enough that her attorney had negotiated a plea bargain: 3 years probation, full restitution of the stolen money, and testimony against Jake in exchange for avoiding prison time. The testimony had been the final humiliation. In open court, Tessa had detailed their affair, their theft, and their murder planning with the mechanical precision of someone who'd been broken by circumstances beyond her control. She'd admitted to being willing to abandon Emma, to stealing nearly $500,000, and to encouraging Jake's violent fantasies about Victor's death. "I lost my mind," she'd whispered into the microphone. "I lost sight of everything that mattered and convinced myself that what we were doing was justified." Victor had watched from the gallery as his wife, his ex-wife, destroyed any remaining sympathy she might have claimed. The woman who'd once made him believe in love and family had revealed herself to be someone capable of planning his murder for insurance money. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence had been the social destruction that followed their exposure. Denver's elite circles were small and unforgiving, and news of the affair and murder conspiracy had spread through the community like wildfire. Tessa found herself blacklisted from every social organization she'd valued, expelled from the country club, and shunned by friends who couldn't reconcile the woman they'd known with the criminal she'd proven to be. Jake's family had disowned him completely. His parents had issued a public statement expressing their shock and apologizing to Victor for their son's actions. His younger sister had changed her last name to distance herself from the scandal. "The hardest part," Monica had told Victor during one of their awkward conversations about Emma's welfare, "is realizing we never really knew them. Tessa was always self-centered, but this? Planning to murder your husband and abandon your daughter? I don't even recognize her anymore." Victor had accepted Monica's attempt at reconciliation with professional courtesy, but no warmth. She'd been too quick to believe Tessa's initial claims of victimhood, too willing to assume Victor was the villain in their marriage's collapse. Trust, once lost, was something Victor never restored. The financial consequences were equally comprehensive. Tessa had been forced to liquidate her hidden assets, sell her car, and move into a studio apartment in one of Denver's less desirable neighborhoods. The woman who'd lived in $1 million home and spent money like water now worked as a retail clerk, struggling to make ends meet while paying restitution and legal fees. Jake's assets had been seized entirely, leaving him with nothing but prison debts and the certainty that his future after release would be spent working minimum-wage jobs that didn't require background checks. But the most important consequence was Emma's stability and happiness. In the months since Tessa's departure, Victor's daughter had bloomed in ways that made him realize how much stress the toxic environment had created for her. She was more confident, more open, more willing to share her thoughts and feelings without fear of being dismissed or ignored. "I don't miss the fighting," Emma had told him one evening as they worked on her homework together. "I don't miss feeling like I was always bothering someone." "You never bother me, sweetheart." "I know, Daddy. That's why I like it being just us." Dr. Chun, the child psychologist, had confirmed Victor's observations during their regular sessions. "Emma is thriving," she'd reported. "Children are remarkably resilient when they feel secure and loved." The removal of instability and conflict from her environment has allowed her natural personality to emerge. Victor had enrolled Emma in private school, where her intelligence and determination had impressed teachers who described her as mature beyond her years, but still appropriately childlike in her enthusiasms. She'd made friends, excelled academically, and shown no signs of psychological damage from her mother's abandonment. Some children would be devastated by this kind of family trauma, Dr. Chun had explained. But Emma has always had one completely reliable parent who prioritized her welfare above everything else. That foundation of security is allowing her to process these changes without significant psychological damage. The business had thrived as well. Jake's removal had eliminated the inefficiencies and ethical compromises that had been slowly corrupting Victor's company culture. The publicity from the criminal case had actually enhanced Victor's reputation in Denver's business community, where his handling of the betrayal was seen as evidence of strong character and decisive leadership. "You could have covered it up," his friend and fellow contractor Miguel Sandoval had told him. "Handled it quietly, avoided the public spectacle. Most people would have taken the path of least resistance." "Most people don't understand that cancer needs to be cut out completely," Victor had replied. "Half measures just allow the disease to spread." Now, as Victor left the courthouse after Jake's sentencing, he reflected on the completeness of his victory. His enemies had been destroyed professionally, financially, socially, and legally. His daughter was safe, happy, and growing stronger every day. His business was more successful than ever. But more importantly, Victor had proven to himself that the man who'd crawled out of poverty and violence was still there beneath the surface. The man who understood that the world was divided into predators and prey, and that survival required ensuring you were never again caught in a position of weakness. As he drove home to pick up Emma from school, Victor allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd won completely, and his enemies would spend years, if not decades, paying for their betrayal. Justice, Victor reflected, was sometimes a dish best served with overwhelming force. Chapter 9. Victory and New Beginnings. 1 year after Jake's sentencing, Victor stood in the backyard of his new house, a custom-built fortress in the foothills overlooking Denver, designed with security systems that would make the previous year's improvised prison look primitive. Emma was practicing martial arts forms on the wooden deck he'd built for her training, her movements precise and confident under the guidance of Master Chun, the retired Marine Corps instructor Victor had hired as her personal coach. "Higher with the block, Emma," Master Chun called out. "Remember, in a real situation, hesitation gets you hurt." Emma adjusted her stance and repeated the movement with the kind of focused intensity that reminded Victor of himself at that age. The intensity of someone who understood that the world was dangerous and that strength was the only reliable protection. "Good," Victor said as Emma finished her routine. "But remember, the goal isn't just to defend yourself. It's to make sure anyone who threatens you regrets the decision." Emma nodded seriously, wiping sweat from her forehead with the towel Victor handed her. At 7 years old, she was already showing signs of the mental toughness that would serve her well in life. She'd adapted to her new reality with remarkable resilience, and Victor was proud of the strong, independent girl she was becoming. The doorbell rang, and Victor checked his security monitor to see Carl Hoffman, his private investigator, standing on the front porch with a manila envelope. Victor had continued employing Hoffman for various security matters, background checks on potential employees, due diligence on business partners, and occasional surveillance of people who'd shown interest in his affairs. "What do you have for me, Carl?" Victor asked as he opened the door. "Updates on your former wife and brother-in-law," Hoffman replied, settling into the living room chair that had become his usual spot during these quarterly briefings. Victor poured himself a scotch, not the bottle Jake had stolen, which he'd thrown away rather than drink something contaminated by betrayal, and waited for the report. Jake Morrison was released on parole last month after serving 18 months, Hoffman began. He's living in a halfway house in Colorado Springs, working the night shift at a warehouse that loads trucks. His parole officer says he's been compliant, but describes him as broken, no initiative, no plans, just going through the motions of existence. Victor nodded. 18 months in state prison would have been educational for someone like Jake, who'd spent his life coasting on charm and family connections. The reality of being surrounded by men who'd lived hard lives and had no patience for entitled weakness would have destroyed whatever remained of his self-image. "Any contact with Tessa?" Victor asked. "None. She won't take his calls, won't visit, won't even acknowledge his existence." Jake's cellmate told his girlfriend that Jake spends most of his time writing letters that never get answered. The information satisfied Victor in ways that simple imprisonment couldn't. Jake wasn't just paying for his crimes. He was experiencing the same betrayal and abandonment he'd planned to inflict on Victor. The woman he'd been willing to commit murder for had discarded him the moment he became a liability rather than an asset. "What about Tessa?" Hoffman's expression grew more serious. "That's more complicated. She completed her probation 6 months ago, finished paying restitution, and has been working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in Aurora. But there have been some concerning developments." Victor set down his scotch, his attention sharpening. "What kind of developments?" "She's been asking questions about you and Emma. Indirect questions, through mutual acquaintances, about your routines, your security, Emma's school. Nothing actionable, but persistent enough to suggest she's planning something." "Planning what?" "Unknown. Could be legitimate desire to reconnect with her daughter. Could be something else entirely." "But Victor, there's something else you need to know." Hoffman opened the manila envelope and spread several photographs across the coffee table. They showed Tessa meeting with a man Victor didn't recognize, someone with the lean build and watchful eyes of someone comfortable with violence. His name is Derek Walsh. Former military, dishonorable discharge for assault, multiple arrests for assault and battery. He's been seen with Tessa 6 times over the past month, always in locations where they thought they wouldn't be noticed. Victor studied the photographs with growing interest rather than concern. "What's their relationship?" "Unclear. Could be romantic, could be professional. But Walsh has a history of taking money for security work that crossed legal boundaries. If Tessa hired him, it's not for legitimate purposes." "Any indication of specific plans?" "Not yet, but my instincts tell me she's building up to something. The questions about your security, the meetings with Walsh, the way she's been careful to stay under the radar, it feels like preparation." Victor leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. A year of punishment had apparently not been enough to teach Tessa the futility of opposing him. If anything, her time in exile had simply allowed her resentment to fester into something more dangerous. "Keep watching her," Victor said. "I want to know everything. Where she lives, where she works, who she talks to, what she buys. And give me everything you can find on this Walsh character." "Already working on it." "But Victor, if she's planning something violent, then she's about to learn that I've spent the past year preparing for exactly that possibility." After Hoffman left, Victor walked through his house, mentally cataloging the security measures he'd implemented. Motion sensors, cameras, reinforced doors and windows, a safe room that could withstand sustained assault, and communication systems that would bring armed response within minutes. The house was a fortress, but it was also a trap for anyone foolish enough to threaten what Victor protected. Emma appeared in the doorway, having finished her shower and changed into regular clothes. "Was that Mr. Hoffman?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart. Just routine business." Is mommy causing trouble again? The directness of the question didn't surprise Victor. Emma had always been perceptive, and the past year had sharpened her instincts about potential threats to their stability. Maybe, Victor replied honestly. But if she is, we're ready for it. Emma nodded with a matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd learned that life included people who couldn't be trusted or reasoned with. Are you going to hurt her if she tries to hurt us? Victor knelt to his daughter's eye level, studying the serious expression on her young face. Emma, I will do whatever is necessary to protect you. That's what fathers do. They make sure their children are safe, no matter what the cost. Even if it means being scary. Sometimes being scary is the only way to protect the people you love. Emma hugged him fiercely, and Victor felt the familiar surge of protective fury that had driven every decision over the past year. His daughter understood the world in ways that most adults never would. Understood that safety required strength, that threats required elimination, and that love sometimes wore the face of control violence. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Victor stood on his deck overlooking the city lights of Denver and considered his options. If Tessa was indeed planning some kind of revenge or rescue attempt involving Emma, she would need to be stopped with the same thoroughness that had characterized his response to her original betrayal. But this time would be different. This time, Victor wouldn't need to gather evidence or build legal cases. This time, he could respond to a direct threat with direct action, and no court in the world would question a father's right to protect his child from a woman who'd already proven herself capable of planning murder. Victor's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. You took everything from me. Now I'm going to take everything from you. Victor smiled as he screenshot the message and forwarded it to Hoffman. Tessa had just provided the evidence he'd need to justify whatever response became necessary. Some people never learned. They mistook patience for weakness, preparation for paranoia, and love for something that could be exploited rather than something that made him more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. Victor Romero had built his life on the principle that betrayal was never forgiven and threats were eliminated completely. If his ex-wife wanted to test that principle, she was welcome to try. After all, he'd spent the past year preparing